Good afternoon. For those of you who know about me or have shared much of my ideas and the postings of the many graphics about on Facebook in the platform called conscientization. And to my friends in my area of business, 45 years engaged with the market of colored gemstones, mining, and global distribution. And from the ma and pa store to the current development and the finalization of the gem files, which will cover the functionality, enhancement, enrichment in the use of AI, artificial intelligence, and in a very expedient, speedy use of the in what I call the quantum computation. This will create a new infrastructure in the handling of a global market close to 1 trillion or in the area of $800 billion. That is the commercial side of me. That's the other part of it. And by the same token, in my latest development, my concern about my work, where I have developed the counseling system called the 3 Cs, involving the communication dynamics, communication analytica, and the analysis, all from the key element called cultural sphere. As a cross-cultural person with the born in China, raised in Brazil, and 50 years away from the Asian region and going back from my cross-cultural experience with the 5 languages, this is really ultimately a focus of the concentration that I put myself forth for all these years. The summary of all things can starting right now with what I started to write into 150 pages with the use and assistance of ChatGPT, with the other consultation group of the Gemini, and also in the Claude. All these AI tools are marvelous because the Claude and the other platforms can provide me also with the graphics and designs. But in the meantime, I'm almost having a dialogue daily with ChatGPT, where my questions or the comments I put forth is fairly lengthy in paragraphs, and all is about the subject matter that I am writing about, the pedagogy of conscience. I'm actually inviting or provoking to the global universities, colleges, school, high school, people involving education to take a good look at it. This is not a name or fame. It's nothing about the what I have started. Um, of course, I'll be recognized and I'll be shared with this kind of exposure in my traditional 4 languages: Spanish, Portuguese, English, Chinese, started with Cantonese, and I will go on with Mandarin and so on and so forth. What is very important is basically in this 45 years, my post gemstone minerals, I call it my life in the desert, but in the real human life with game people play, power, greed, and whatnot. And commercially or economically, I have done what I want to accomplish. And finally, by the passage of life, by the engagement with people, with the real situations, and upon reflection, I have just come to the conclusion this particular term about pedagogy or the techniques of teaching and about human conscience can be a great contribution to all and possible as one of the potential peace solutions in and amongst us. And let me put it in this context. I have embraced Paulo Freire, the Brazilian thinker, philosopher, teacher, and a master in his description with the conscience, starting with the conscience in action, in motion, in activation, to conscientize, and in Portuguese, conscientiza, then would become conscientization. It is upon many years of reflection to look at Paulo Freire's work to see how he was falsely accused in the political scenario, put him into the left, and by linking him with the liberation theology at the time in the 60s in Brazil. And don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong about the liberation theologians. All this will come into context about the awareness of conscience and why and how it happened with the struggle of the thinkers, philosophers of these religious Roman Catholics seeking help and assistance from the Roman Catholic Church to help the poor in Brazil, just as Paulo Freire did. And the Pedagogy of Conscience may give some good answers why this well-educated, well-disciplined Roman Catholic clergy had met their ceilings. And by the way, I was raised Roman Catholic. I was baptized 6, 7 years old in Macau. I was baptized by the mission of the Matteo Ricci from Italy, and then have gone to school with the Salesians, some known as Don Bosco in Brazil, in Macau, and eventually immigrated to Brazil. I continued my education with the Salesians. I embraced my Roman Catholic education very dearly, for not the exposure to the church, the learning of English in Macau, and then serving Mass with Latin and singing Gregorian chants. I would not been able to have the capacity and capability in the handling of Spanish, Portuguese, and a great degree Italian. The education, I will also speaking to my Chinese audience. I have heard some accusations, well, you're overly westernized, it's not much about you have learned in China. And let me remind all of you, under the Portuguese and English colony in that time, in the mid-50s, the colonizers are not obligated to provide education to the residents. They occupy the land they took by force. Eventually, the Brits had developed better educational system. But in between that time, most of the education and schooling from both cities were fostered by the Roman Catholics and also the Protestant church. The colonized had no reason to spend money to get the public or the people they dominate to become better educated. Case in point, the biggest failure, economic failure and damage among one of the British colonies, and just take a look at the country of Jamaica. Why Hong Kong become progressive? Because there was trade, there were continuous, the abuse, the colonizers, the use of the goddamn opium, and the money generated from opium, with 80% of these British companies still exploiting the gain from opium, turning into cash, turning into money to have built more industry for their own earning. Remember well, the wealth between China and India until somewhere in the neighborhood 1840s were all looted, taken away by the British. And also, have no qualm to tell most of the American hiding behind so-called China trade were all involved in opium. As a matter of fact, the family of Roosevelt, first the Delano Russell group, were taking opium from Turkey selling into China. However, the future in-laws of the Rothschild family from London, Iraqi Jews, the Sassoons, had already planting opium in the British-dominated Bangladesh, and the entire fortune, if you want to imagine the amount of money they have taken out of China, is hard to measure how much they have taken. First, opium was just to recuperate the overspended silver the British by drinking tea. Just for a little bit of funny passage, I'm not trying to blame the Portuguese. The English ladies, literally at that particular time in point, had no idea of table manners and the use of silver. Who had introduced to these British ladies was a lady named Catalina de Bragança from Portugal. And also Catalina de Bragança had introduced the Brits the habit and the liking of drinking tea. And just imagine the human vice from tea, eventually linking to the devastation of China and the 100-year humiliation, and devastated all the silver from China because of opium. But opium was not the only vice, starting with tea. Yes, there will be a coverage on the opium Holocaust, where I have also in this book in the writing now of the Pedagogy of Conscience. I'm started a sequence of thoughts, finding out why conscience has been ignored by the world, but never were ignored by the Chinese. As a matter of fact, conscience is the language of the heart. And by me linking to Paulo Freire, to the Ming Dynasty 1500, Wang Yangming, a Chinese thinker, philosopher in the Ming court, and also just so happened, my family, my father's origin, we share the same heritage in the region where Wang Yangming was born, the city of Yuyao, next to today Ningpo. Now today, Yuyao is a suburb of Ningpo. And Wang Yangming's dynamic thinking, where he had put together the entire three main disciplines of China, the teaching of Confucius, the short abbreviated the teaching of Lao Tzu, or the Tao, Taoism, D-A-O, or Taoism, T-A-O. Also, the teaching of Buddha, by way of Buddha brought in his value with his compassionate as a model into the Chinese. And looking back, all their advocacy, all the teaching were about to cultivate the human conscience. The conscience in Chinese is made of two words, liang xin, kindness and heart, or to cultivate the kind heart. And in the use of Paulo Freire's conscientização or conscientization and Wang Yangming's writing in the 1500s, he also have spoken to induce and to put forth to foster kind knowledge to the people. And because my cross-cultural background with these languages, it threw me oftentimes into a broader or a wider range of thinking. When I discover conscience is not any mechanism and is not of any methodology. It's very simple. Conscience is just to cultivate the deeper thinking of man. And subsequently, I create a term for the easier English speaking, the domain of lingua franca is the conqueror's language after the Portuguese, Spanish, and the Iberian languages, the English and their creation by way of the Industrial Revolution, the gunboats and the steam engine had let them become the dominator of the world, eventually added on by the expansion and the rise of the American with two other industrial revolutions, be that of the petroleum and also in our time period, the use of internet, computer, and then the rest of the software like Microsoft's spreadsheets and words. I make this very quickly because the purpose of my presenting this process, my personal process of pedagogy of conscience, is where I think in the same duration of time, Wang Yangming, 1500 Ming Dynasty, become one of the most prominent scholar because he had actually accelerated, speed up by his thinking. He basically overturned another thinker philosopher of the Neo-Confucianism in the Song Dynasty. But in the meantime, what had happened? That's my personal question. What happened to the block of his brilliant thinking, the confluence of the three philosophy? I have not yet including the older thinking called Yi Jing, or the time of the pre-written language in borderlining the Chinese early mythology of Fu Xi. But what happened from 1500 to today is very interesting. This time frame and parallel is no different than 1492, when the Spanish Inquisition started, and when many of the Jewish merchants have financed and funded the voyages of Columbus from Spain to get to the Caribbeans. In the same time period, it's almost 1500 to today, why not the pedagogy of conscience ever developed? And once again, let me repeat, I am doing nothing new. The ideas, the stories, the quotes, you go to Google and quote conscience quotation, you will find thousands and thousands of good men, good people. They all have the idea about conscience. And I have learned my first few words of conscience, awareness of conscience, by watching Walt Disney's storytelling of Pinocchio. And the ambassador of conscience was the little guy named Jimmy the Crickets. Let your conscience be the guide. And of course, the long noses of Pinocchio. So conscience has been around. And let me using another metaphor, the way I just phrased it in one of my platforms. It's like I'm a herbalist using the old Chinese or the old Native Americans everywhere. You're searching, you look for the herbs, the healing plants are everywhere. But they're everywhere along with all the green grass, all the dark jungles, all the streams, all the mountains. Everybody have heard about conscience, and yet there have not been a system of education fostering conscience. And let me credit also more about the advanced thinking of Paulo Freire. One of the examples Paulo had given to many of his students in his lectures is that one of his major mission is to have done his best to trying to eliminate the illiteracy in Brazil from his northeast area, Nordeste in the area, Pernambuco in that region. And of course, I look at the sound of languages, which had help. If my name also, like Paul, is called Paulo, okay, in a Romance language, be that Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, take a little bit away from the French, Romania, it's very simple to pronounce the 5 vowels. A, E, I, O, U in Latin, the Romance language, is A, E, I, O, U. So my name is Pau, A-U, Pau, L-O, Paulo. 63, 64, I was still in Brazil as the junior high student graduating. Paulo Freire has started his initiative to educate the illiterates for one simple purpose, so they can vote. What also registered extremely well marked, well stamped, is what Paulo Freire had always addressed. We have to reduce or drop the drawer education or the banker's drawer education, but the degree I defend the old education, you don't have the internet, you don't have the access to the data, to the information. Today, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatsoever you want. Remembering formulas, remembering formats is part of education. By way of Paulo Freire's idea, education, learning has to be dynamic and had to be dialectic, meaning the teacher learn, the student learn. It's a cohesive unit about education. Draw education to make it more adequate or adapting to the American colloquialism or regionalism. It's like, do not stuff your student like a Thanksgiving bird or duck or turkey or whatsoever. We have learned oftentimes, including in Chinese, we always have said, do not dok sei shu in Cantonese, do not study the book which is dead. In other words, knowledge has been fostered by someone 100 years ago. We're doing the same. However, the mentorship, the language of the conscience, all the 3 branches of the Chinese Buddhist, Confucianist, and Taoist were all addressing the unique quality about human conscience. But to a degree, everybody knows about in Chinese to rhyme the San Zi Jing or Sam Ji Ging in Cantonese and 3-letter words. Well, that eventually 3-letter words becoming the ongoing vulgarity, making fun or poking fun of the quote unquote stiff learning. I think everything is interpretive. So what Paulo Freire has started early on is to creating a very democratic, very much people-oriented. And this is part of my question when I raised now this question about the pedagogy of the oppressed. Some American have taken a different form called the critical psychology, the critical pedagogy, and Paulo Freire wrote his pedagogy of the oppressed. And many had misquoted, deliberate or not, that he was a leftist thinker. He was basically a socialist, communist, and Paulo Freire's name up until 5 years ago during the time of Bolsonaro in Brazil, it had saddened when some of my friends, colleagues, which I have met 53 years later, were using the same speaking ideas and putting Paulo Freire as a communist educator. And by the same token, talking about, not with malice, about their stance with China or with the US. But it was a very sad couple of years, and I hope one day we'll meet again and we can open up to another dialogue without prejudices. But I find this urgency to address the pedagogy of conscience, because by this initiative, you will stop nobody if they can get some sort of guideline. Going back to the subject matter, 1500, Wang Yangming, 1492, the Western expansion, the Western conquest, the Western obsession with the demand, and they feel justify consumer-based capitalism to buy, to consume, to spend more, from tobacco, from tea, from sugar. I'm talking about the world diabetes, from alcohol, from tobacco, and whatever vice. To a certain degree, I would just mention this just a couple of times. In what the American thought of open democracy, but behind it, they were also induced by another form of consumer obsession. Many people think the freedom of choice, the freedom to spend, is that sort of a consumer ecological imbalance consumerism. And one of the major character who built the American into this propagandistic in the 30s, the everybody want to follow the American progress, is Sigmund Freud. I speak of this because I'm a psychologist. And to a degree, I have to speak critically of my discipline, why I am crediting Freud's great discovery. Psychology had allowed an ethnic Jew to become a medical doctor from the School of Medicine in Vienna, Austria. But his nephew, by his marriage, Edward Bernays, becomes almost the god, the deity of consumption, and by his idea of propaganda, by his idea to incite people to drink, smoke. You all can see the footage. It's a 4 hours YouTube footage by the name of The Century of the South, produced by Adam Curtis of BBC. For me, that was a fascinating education lecture, almost 4 hours. But if you take the first an hour and a half, you will have a great idea what is propaganda and how we've been seduced to spend minus spending. But when I'm saying this, you're also relating to another thinking. Now that we in America have a debt of 35 trillion, with 20 trillion spent on between Afghanistan and Iraq. As I hear some American politicians telling the world nations like NATO they have to spend more than 2% of the GNP to help the wars, I want to ask Trump for the same question. What about the 20 trillion Americans spend in the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and what they have caused the refugees, the migrations from the Arabs into Europe? Who are responsible for this sort of chaos, migration, adaptation, transculturally, cross-culturally, and all the hardship and all the spending caused by the war in the Iraq and Afghanistan? But the purpose behind me in here is that this 500-year gap, the absence to find out the conscience competency of China. Now I'm bringing it into economic terms because the progress of the Chinese today, by me, I'm crediting that they have the conscience efficiency. And this should be addressed. The Chinese have not progressed into a second world largest economy without the 800 military bases like the Americans. They have been accused about taking advantage of the Western technology. If that is the case, had not the West taken advantage of the Chinese invention of compass, gunpowder, and paper? In my little dabbling, I got my cross-cultural life are always in the bits and pieces of cultures. From the influence of the Portuguese schools of navigation in the 1400s, in the use of the speedier ship, the caravelas, including the 3 world explorers landed into the Americas and Asia, be that Christopher Columbus. By the way, it's disputable. Columbus, in fact, was Portuguese. Pedro Álvares Cabral, who discovered Brazil, Portuguese, in a very short span of time. Vasco da Gama, who went to Calcutta eventually in Asia, also Portuguese. For many of you who always speaking of the name Magellan, he always troubles me with Magellan. Fernando Magalhães, funded by the Spanish court, also was a Portuguese. And by the book that I'm reading, the Portuguese before 1492, had already discovered Brazil by way of the East African coast, by their trans-navigation between Africa, using that island in the middle of the Atlantic called Tristan da Cunha. An island happened. My family and I have traveled through in 1962 from China to Brazil. It was an island, a volcanic island, which was sinking. We make a brief stop, rescue 3 British scientists. Then we landed in Rio. Books are written for history, but there are other new discoveries and the history behind the Portuguese navigation. I was astonished when I found in this travel, be that in the port in Spain, Sevilla, be that in Canarias or in Portugal, there were already presence of Asian crews in those ships in the 1400s. And subsequently, when I went to Cuba, just for, I mean, this very minute issues. When the Cubans was complimenting me when I can pronounce hierro, because many of the local Cubans, because the speed they speak, this is nothing about, it's nothing derogative. They almost using the L instead of the R. And part of that research was due to, with deeper exchange, many of the deckhands then in the time of the colonial Spain, Portugal, they were Asians, extractions. Again, this is just one of those few things I can marvel a little bit and looking back and then do a little research. But the identity of Christopher Columbus, he named all the islands next to Cuba with the many named the saints. As I have discovered by the suggestion and proposing all the videos and books, that Columbus was the best child between the family lady, his mother's side, Zarco, who were converted Jews. Zarco is one of the major discovery of the island of Madeira. And the father is from the Count of Beja in the region called Alentejo. In fact, a book written about Columbus highlighted Columbus was a Portuguese spy to set the Spanish to land in the Caribbean region in order for the Portuguese to capture the larger and longer routes, the African routes of the Portuguese, and eventually Brazil, because the Spanish forced domination of the Canary Islands. Hearsay or not, make it a little bit fascinating for those who care about looking on the sidelines of history. I am relating to this, going back to my core value about the pedagogy, the teaching, the techniques, how to induce conscious awareness to the world. And this is what I think for all these years of the Western history, many of the Westerners had neglected, plus how to teach conscience. Conscience is the inner value compass in us. And for the Chinese, it's 24/7, 365. The awareness, what we are doing, is it right or wrong? Bring it to the AI terms. This, the thinking, that process in us in nanoseconds. And I hope by this beginning of this advocacy I'm doing now about teaching and the pedagogy of conscience, in less than 3.5 days, by my extended big paragraph questions to insert into ChatGPT, I got a tremendous amount of response with consistent, coherent, written words based on my search to try to clarify when and what. Why is the Chinese awareness of human conscience were not able to have its influence into the West? This is still part of my thinking. I can start it with the 1840, the Opium War, the 100-year of humiliation when the British had the forced trade sales of opium to the Chinese. Why have they been so successful? And also on their entry from the two southern provinces of Guangdong and Fujian. In part, is because the Manchu Empire, the Qing rulers, have dominated the entire of China, expanded the Chinese territory, not then the Chinese, expanded the Qing dynasty, taken Tibet, taken Mongolia, taken Xinjiang, and much larger territory. The Outer Mongolia only was ceded to the Soviet Union after the Second World War. But in that particular size of the empire, the Southern Chinese, one of the major characters, or one of the major hero in Taiwan is called Zhang Chenggong, Cantonese Jiang Xinggong, whose wife was Japanese, who had defended the island of Taiwan vehemently. He and his family, including his father, one-time pirate, had defeated the possession of the contingency of the Dutch. And none of them had cut the hair demanded by the Manchu Empire. So in this region of China, many of these residents, why they were helping the British entry of opium. I even put it, the Jewish opium of Sassoons made their entry into Guangdong. And eventually, opium had defeated the Chinese. While I'm writing my hypothesis in the timeline of the Opium War, its impact also involving a major element. Why opium? My grandfather was a magistrate from Guangxi province. He smoked opium. He had maids and servants that will cook the opium into the blackish balls, smoked. Why did the Chinese, the most affluent family, allow their children to smoke? Again, I will be open to criticism, comments, and counterpoints. I think the opium for the longest time become a form of a drug, like a tranquilizer, that will make the firstborn Chinese, better said in the Latin format, primogenito, the firstborn, the key person of the family wealth. By marriage, generally, they fix the marriage to usually a chubby, a plump, healthier lady by the matchmakers. Make sure the lineage to be continued. Beyond that, the husband can pick up his like of concubines, 1, 2, 3, to whatever. What the Chinese family fear the most, including in my family, is the behavior of the firstborn is not being taken care adequately. Many of them have gone to, because plenty of time on hand. There's no job, there's no career. They can go to the gambling house and then go to the Chinese, then the brothels, but very sophisticated brothels, way above and beyond or before the Japanese idea of geisha. Many prostitutes will sell only their talent and never physically. All patrons have that kind of choice. I think in this particular psychological format, the affluent family want to protect their wealth and not to want their firstborn to go astray or other males. By him stay home, smoking opium is a tranquilizer before they realize that it is a drug, the opiate. And that part of the wealth, affluence of the Manchu, the Qing court, had encouraged many of the affluent Chinese smoking opium. Why the Southerners from Fujian, from Guangdong, have zero gumptions to help the Brits or the merchants to market, to sell to the Chinese. And eventually, from the earning of the opium above and beyond the silver they recuperate, they always turn into merchandise. That's why you have all the Hong, or the companies in Hong Kong, Guangdong, even Macau. So the southern region of the Chinese literally have zero loyalty. There's no such a thing called nationalism. The nationalism of the Chinese had not come into being until, by my count, 1948, the year I was born, and the forming of the China by Mao. In between that time, the huge chaos from the time of the decline of the Manchu Empire, ruined by the massive purchasing and smoking, using consumption of opium, and then incoming the Republic, very weak by Sun Yat-sen, and then the weak China had lost even their posturing, their status even they were part of the victor allies of the World War One. And another insult to the Chinese was the Treaty of Versailles, where the Allies had given the German possessions of the province of Shandong and the city of Qingdao, instead returning to China. They have ceded that to the Japanese. Directly or not, that was the introduction and the induction of the Japanese interest to exploit then a weak China. Eventually had led to the entry into Manchuria and followed by the 8 years in 1937 until 45. But all in all, the weakening of the Chinese, the weak republic, the fight of the warlords, China was totally fragmented, including Dr. Sun's own saying, Chinese is like a pot of sand. We have to credit, like it or not, the term communism is almost the dirtiest word in all my life. I'm 76. I've always raised question why people deliberately in propaganda, communism. I read a little bit differently by just watching and reading the work of Marx and Engels. Not want to have a terminology in my head. Well, these people are the humanists. Can they allow the Tsar Russia or the kingdoms and the empire of the Germanic, of the Habsburgs, of the English Germanic be, can the people, the poor folks, is forever the indentured slave? They will have to fight and die for the Russian Empire? Again, these are the questions. This is part of the Chinese, I call it diaspora. 1800s had also created one of the dispatch of the Chinese, often unknown to many, were sold to the Americas, first with the gold rush, eventually with the railroad. Eventually, when the American slavery is being abolished, many of the Chinese literally become the indentured slaves. Again, I pick up parts and pieces of the Chinese in Peru. They were sold there to collect guano. There's no fixed number how many have died from the toxicity of the feces of the birds. And their Chinese were also sold to Jamaica, and the Chinese landing into Cuba with ethnic Chinese fighting for the Cuba independence. So in this joint thinking, bits and pieces, what I'm trying to articulate, if the conscience or the advocacy or the teaching as a pedagogy is still a challenge, how to teach conscience to the general public. And another barrier, which is totally cultural, is that the four branch of the Western religion started with Judaism, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Islamism, because of their isms and religious orientation, using a Freudian projection. Whoever, the Western scholars, academicians, in what time and period, had also labeled the teaching of Confucius as Confucianism. The teaching of Tao is Taoism, and the teaching of Buddha is Buddhism. And visually, the West by the entry of the missionaries and others, by their view of the temples, no different. Many are just ancestral halls, and the Chinese also have built temples venerating the men of good for their heroism, how they defend their time and dynasty. So this misconception, by putting all Chinese philosophies into ism, automatically these monotheist scholars have put the Chinese philosophical disciplines advocating human conscience into the same sphere as religion. I'm no going to say, including Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, both were Protestants. Sun Yat-sen had gone into one of the ancestral halls and broken the hands of a statue. Idolatry. But I also, at the same breath, taking pride of my association, where I was first baptized by the mission of Matteo Ricci from Italy, and later on my other linkage association with the Salesians, also from Italy, the Don Bosco schools. Matteo Ricci was the one and only Westerners who had gained his entry into the courts of the Qing rulers. And by him saying this, I still have to go into the records for all the Ricci centers within Italy, in Beijing and in somewhere in Macau. Matteo Ricci had made that comment. These people in China do not need to be evangelized. Other than the brilliant academic scholar and providing the map, a creation of the map. This is the first time I hear from some of the writings, some of the comments, and Matteo Ricci trying to emerge the Chinese values along with the Roman Catholic discipline. So in all that I do in trying to keep my speaking less than 1 hour, I'm exploring. I hope by this sharing and talk later on in Chinese and in Portuguese and Spanish, I hope my academicians, religious orders can find these particular sayings from Matteo Ricci, who was facing the reprimand from Rome and who was criticized by his fellow missionaries from the other two religious groups, either the harsh Dominicans or the Franciscans. So this bits and pieces of history, with my observation, with my best intentions to foster the pedagogy of conscience to all the schools. And this may be fostering a huge change when we can think with our heart. And conscience is a screener from the malignant intelligence, from the power of man and the greed of man. Conscience is the real filter to obtain knowledge and turn workable knowledge into productive intelligence, often not for the universal application, but for those few that found it intelligent, package them into a product or into a patent, into a copyright today, and benefit from it. But conscience is a tool that will filter the negatives of intelligence out in his own atmosphere and move that into the realm or the cultural sphere of wisdom. and from wisdom sphere that can be put back ecologically into the larger body of the human body of knowledge. I hope this will give some idea, inspirations, including counterpoints, criticism by what I have mentioned. But I put my ideas in this development of the pedagogy of conscience, and I will use continuously, including my book, will be cited with the question and the response I have generated by ChatGPT. If and when I can be fostering knowledge in this record speed of 150 pages so far in 3 days, just imagine how many knowledgeable content out there that can be generated by the larger mass. And yet, I created a mechanism. All this transfer, citing of knowledge will have a verification process. That is what's going to make our generation of knowledge seeking with a lot of excitement, because all the contents can be challenged by adding to it, by giving a different angle, a different takeoff. My intention is the program I have just created called the Open Books. The books you write, or chapter that you write, a comment that you make on videos can be shared, open to the contribution from all others. We are actually reformatting the system of learning and education here onward. I thank you for your attention, and I hope this will add to part of my portfolio with the other groups, from gemstones to Romantina, the language, to Pictory Web, Open Books Now, and the Pedagogy of Conscience, and much more. Feel free to contact me by email, phone, or any other format. Have a pleasant evening. Pronto, Gustavo? Gravei. Tá.